It began in a place whose name meant peace. Shiloh in ancient Hebrew, a word whispered to evoke tranquility, yet in the spring of 1862, amid the tangled woodlands of southwestern Tennessee, peace was buried beneath cannon, smoke, and tangled limbs. The earth drank deeply that April, not water, blood. This was no symbolic skirmish or frontier flare-up. This was the first great cataclysm of the American Civil War. The moment when both North and South awoke from patriotic dreams and tasted the iron truth of modern warfare at Shiloh. The Union bled, the Confederacy fractured, and America realized this was not a war to parade through, but one to crawl out of, if it survived at all. But how did the road to Shiloh begin? And why, in the thick woods by a modest church, did the Confederacy wager everything and lose more than just a battle? To understand Shiloh, one must first understand Corinth and the Confederacy running out of time. The year was 1862. The Union, under the sharp and silent Ulysses S. Grant, had scored twin victories at Forts Henry and Donelson, two Confederate strongholds that had guarded the rivers like sentries. Their fall opened Tennessee like a wound. The Confederate line, once drawn with confidence through Kentucky and Middle Tennessee, collapsed. Into this vacuum stepped General Albert Sidney Johnston, a man crushed beneath expectation, tasked with defending a territory greater than the entire country of France. With fewer troops than his Virginian counterpart, Johnston was scorned by Confederate politicians and public alike. When he gave up Kentucky and evacuated Nashville, Tennessee's capital and industrial heartbeat, many branded him a coward. But Johnston wasn't a coward. He was a realist. He knew the South's survival didn't rest on holding every mile, but on choosing the right one to fight for. And that mile, he believed, was in Mississippi at a sleepy junction town called Corinth. Why Corinth? Railroads. Two of the South's most vital rail lines, the Memphis and Charleston and the Mobile in Ohio, intersected here. If Corinth fell, Memphis would follow, and the Confederacy's Western logistics would unravel. In Johnston's mind, Corinth was not just a crossroads. It was the vertebrae of the spine. But Johnston's command was fragile. His army underfed, underarmed, and reeling from retreat needed something more than supplies. It needed a reason to believe. Into this breach stepped a man of fire and vision, General P. G. T. Beauregard, the hero of Fort Sumter, the darling of Southern newspapers, and the architect of audacious plans. Beauregard believed the South could strike first, that if they moved quickly before Union General Don Carlos Buell could link up with Grant, they could shatter the Union force at Pittsburgh Landing and perhaps, just perhaps, drive the Yankees all the way back to the Kentucky border. It was a gamble, but to Johnston, it was the only move left on a narrowing board. On the 3rd of April, 1862, the Confederate Army began its march from Corinth 45. 000 strong in name, but green, disorganized, and weary. A 20-mile journey took 3 confused, mud-soaked days. By dusk on the 5th of April, they were in position. The attack was supposed to begin that morning, but now many officers, including Beauregard, urged retreat. The element of surprise was gone. The men were exhausted. The risk was too great. Johnston disagreed. I would fight them if they were 1,000,000, he said, unknowingly sealing his own fate. The morning of the 6th of April dawned with eerie silence, broken only by the occasional crack of musket fire. Colonel Everett Peabody of the Union Army, suspecting something was wrong, had sent out a patrol into the woods near Shiloh Church. What they found confirmed his fears: Confederate pickets, and behind them, the full weight of Johnston's army. At 530, the Confederates attacked. Union camps, unfortified and unprepared, were shattered. Men were bayoneted in their tents. Horses fled in terror. Thousands of Green recruits dropped their rifles and ran, but others, notably under General William Tecumseh Sherman and General Benjamin Prentiss, rallied and resisted. Sherman himself, struck in the hand and losing multiple aides, refused to yield. By 700, the battlefield was engulfed in chaos. Confederate columns surged through the underbrush, hampered by dense woods and thick gun smoke. Friendly fire incidents were frequent. Units broke and reformed again and again. Johnston, ever at the front, rode tirelessly along the lines, rallying regiments with calm determination. But the Union had its anchor, a sunken road turned makeshift trench, a position later known as the Hornet's Nest. Here, Prentiss and a division of hard men held, hour after hour. Confederate waves broke against the road's embankment. Artillery roared. The air thickened with lead. And then, at the worst possible moment for the South, tragedy struck. Johnston, leading a charge near the peach orchard, was shot in the thigh. He slumped in his saddle. His officers thought it minor, but the bullet had severed the popliteal artery. Johnston bled out in minutes, his boot filling with blood, his voice silent forever. Jefferson Davis would later mourn, "The South has lost her Washington." Command passed to Beauregard, but the drive was gone. Though Confederates pushed hard, the final breakthrough never came. By nightfall, Union lines held atop a final ridge near Pittsburgh Landing, reinforced by gunboats, Tyler and Lexington firing from the river. Confederate troops, exhausted, hungry, and stunned, slept where they could. Beauregard, now in command, believed the enemy would retreat come dawn. He was wrong. Rain fell through the night cold, steady, unforgiving. The drenched soldiers of both armies huddled in the muck, exhausted, wounded, or simply too stunned to sleep. Union General Ulysses S. Grant, his ankle bandaged from a riding accident, sat beneath a tree with his coat over his shoulders, cigar clenched tight. Enduring the storm, a subordinate suggested the army should retreat. Grant stared into the black woods and said calmly, "We'll attack at daylight." By morning, the Confederates were a shadow of their former self. Beauregard's forces had fought themselves into exhaustion the day before. Thousands of men were lost, wounded, or had simply vanished. Still, others had spent the night looting Union camps, their discipline now diluted. As dawn broke on the 7th of April, they were not ready. But Grant was, reinforced overnight by Don Carlos Buell's men and the lost division of General Lew Wallace, who had wandered off course the day before and missed the battle entirely. Grant now commanded over 45 new soldiers, and he wasted no time. At 0500, the Union counterattack began. This time, it was the South's turn to reel. Forced to fight defensively through the same tangled forests and smoke-filled groves they had attacked the day before, Confederate lines began buckling. Grant's men, galvanized by vengeance and fresh legs, drove the enemy steadily backward. Nathan Bedford Forrest, the fierce Confederate cavalry commander, scouted the rear and realized the truth. The Confederacy was about to be routed. When he warned Beauregard, he was dismissed again. Forrest would mutter, "We'll be whipped like hell before the day is out." By mid-afternoon, the Union had regained nearly all the ground it had lost. The Confederate withdrawal turned from an orderly retreat to a stumbling flight at 1,530. The battle ended. Grant, bloodied but victorious, stood among the wreckage. The price was staggering. Over 23. No men killed, wounded, or missing. More than all previous American battles combined, the nation was horrified. Critics lambasted Grant as reckless. Rumors resurfaced about his drinking. Demands for his resignation echoed through Washington. But President Abraham Lincoln saw something deeper. "I cannot spare this man," he said. "He fights." Beauregard, meanwhile, led his battered army back to Corinth, Mississippi. He had lost not just the battle, but the initiative. The momentum in the West had shifted, and the South would never again fight so close to the Ohio River. But the war in the West was far from over. Corinth, Mississippi, May 1862, a town of 3,000 was now the center of the Confederacy's desperate defense. Beauregard, now leading the Army of Mississippi, had turned the rail junction into a fortress. Earthworks, trenches, and artillery dotted the hillsides. But with only 65,000 men, many still recovering from Shiloh, he faced an impossible task. Disease spread faster than bullets. Dysentery, typhoid, and dehydration turned Corinth into a pestilent trap. The town's water supply was tainted. The heat of a Mississippi spring ripened the stench of rot. One Confederate surgeon wrote, "We are buried alive among the dead." Against them came Major General Henry Halleck, who had arrived after Shiloh to assume command of all Union forces in the West. Halleck, a master of logistics but timid in battle, was determined not to repeat the chaos of Shiloh. Instead of a bold assault, he advanced slowly, cautiously, with 120 troops. It was not so much a siege as it was a creeping wall of dirt. Every day, Halleck's men dug new trenches. Every night, they inched closer to Corinth. Every position was fortified before the next step forward. By May 29th, Union artillery could finally strike the town. But there was nothing left to strike. Beauregard, ever the showman, staged a brilliant deception. He ordered his men to cheer loudly, issued fake rations, and even sent sick men parading as fresh reinforcements. Meanwhile, trains removed the real army by night. When Union troops entered Corinth on May 30th, they found an empty shell. The Confederacy had slipped away again, but left behind only disease, death, and decay. Halleck had won a town, but lost an opportunity. Grant wanted to push on immediately toward Vicksburg, the fortress city on the Mississippi River that would become the key to controlling the West. But Halleck said no. The army was sick, supplies were short, and the railways were in ruins. So the army sat, and the war waited. While Union forces stalled in Mississippi, Jefferson Davis looked elsewhere for a breakthrough north into Kentucky. Kentucky, a border state with divided loyalties, had remained officially neutral. But Confederate generals like Edmund Kirby Smith and Braxton Bragg believed it could be won. Kentucky, they argued, was ripe for the taking and ready to rise. They were wrong. In the summer of 1862, Bragg and Smith launched a bold campaign. Smith's troops pushed through the Cumberland Gap, while Bragg's army embarked on a massive 776-mile rail journey to Chattanooga. Their goal was not just military, it was political. Capture Kentucky, arm new recruits, and change the tide of the war. The results were mixed. Smith won a dramatic victory at Richmond, Kentucky, capturing thousands. Bragg captured Munfordville. Panic swept across Ohio, but Kentucky did not rise. The promised thousands of Confederate volunteers never materialized. Bragg, with only 40,000 men, could not hold the state. Meanwhile, Union General Don Carlos Buell advanced cautiously. Lincoln, furious with Buell's hesitation, threatened to remove him. By October 1862, both armies converged at Perryville, a chaotic and misunderstood battle fought over water, not strategy. Neither side realized the other's full strength. Attacks were piecemeal. Communication failed. Nightfall ended the battle before a decision was reached. But in the aftermath, Bragg retreated. He had gambled on Kentucky and lost. The Confederate High Command was bitterly divided. Smith and Bragg blamed each other. Jefferson Davis, unwilling to choose between them, merged their commands into a new force, the Army of Tennessee. But unity would remain elusive. The seeds of dysfunction laid at Shiloh, fermented at Corinth, and bloomed in Kentucky would haunt the South's Western theater for the rest of the war. As 1,862 waned, so too did the Confederate dream of reclaiming Kentucky. Bragg's forces, humiliated but intact, retreated to Murfreesboro, Tennessee. The Union, meanwhile, replaced Buell with a fresh commander, Major General William S. Rosecrans. He was methodical, cerebral, and full of quiet defiance. Lincoln was desperate for a victory. The Union had recently suffered a bloody disaster at Fredericksburg. Morale in the North was low. Europe was watching, and so, with the weight of expectation pressing on his shoulders, Rosecrans set out to deliver a symbolic and strategic blow. He would march south from Nashville, confront Bragg, and break the Confederate hold over Middle Tennessee. By the 26th of December, Rosecrans's Army of the Cumberland, nearly 45,000 strong, moved toward Murfreesboro. Bragg's Army of Tennessee, numbering around 38. Ling waited behind Stone's River, a narrow, winding waterway that would soon run red. On the evening of the 30th of December, both armies made the same decision: attack the enemy's right flank at dawn. But Bragg acted first at 0600 on New Year's Eve. Confederate General William J. Hardee's corps slammed into the Union right, commanded by General Alexander McCook. It was a brutal, merciless assault. The Union line crumpled like paper. Artillery was overrun. Entire brigades shattered. Men were cut down mid-meal. Rifles still stacked in pyramids from the night before. Yet amid the chaos, one man held firm: Philip Sheridan. Sheridan's division had anticipated an early strike and stood ready. From within a cedar thicket, soon nicknamed the Slaughter Pen, his men repulsed wave after wave of Confederate attacks. By mid-morning, Sheridan's line was surrounded on three sides, but he refused to break. Eventually, ammunition gave out. Sheridan fell back, not in panic, but in grit. Further north, General George Thomas, later known as the Rock of Chickamauga, anchored the Union center, holding firm. And there, beside his men, was Rosecrans himself. He rode the field, sword drawn, his uniform spattered with blood, not his own, but of aides struck down beside him. Confederate momentum peaked by noon. Bragg's hammering had driven the Union back 3 miles but failed to break them. Then came a moment of blunder. On the Confederate right, General John C. Breckinridge hesitated. He had seen Union forces cross the river earlier, a feint that had long since withdrawn and assumed an attack was imminent. Instead of reinforcing Hardee, he stood idle. By dusk, the battle was indecisive. Bragg believed the Union would retreat by morning, but Rosecrans had no intention of yielding. As he and Thomas surveyed the battered field that night, they made a stark decision. They would not give up Middle Tennessee. The 1st of January, 1863, passed with cold rain and silence. The battlefield became a mire. Dead men lay unburied. Wounded cried out beneath makeshift shelters across Stone's River. Both sides stared at one another, each unsure of the other's next move. Then came the trap. On the 2nd of January, Bragg sought to break the deadlock. He ordered Breckinridge to assault the Union left flank, which he believed was vulnerable, but it was a fatal miscalculation. Rosecrans, anticipating the move, had positioned artillery 57 guns across McFadden's Ford. The Union right had retreated across the river the day before. Baiting the trap, Breckinridge's men advanced gallantly, flags fluttering, the stars and bars catching in the bitter wind. Then the cannonade began. Union gunners unleashed a synchronized barrage. Shells screamed over the river. Shrapnel cut down men by the dozen. Breckinridge's corps reeled. One observer likened it to mowing wheat with iron scythes. The assault disintegrated. Hundreds were killed or captured. Bragg's final hope vanished in the smoke. By the 3rd of January, Union reinforcements were arriving. Bragg, his army reduced to barely 20,000 effectives, conceded the field and retreated to Tullahoma. His winter campaign had failed. Yet Stone's River was not just another battlefield. It was a hinge in the Western theater. For the Union, it was a desperately needed victory after Fredericksburg. For Lincoln, it was symbolic validation on the eve of the Emancipation Proclamation's enforcement. For the South, it marked the beginning of internal decay, not of will, but of unity. Bragg's generals despised him. They questioned his decisions, his judgment, and increasingly, his legitimacy. President Davis refused to remove him, fearing the precedent it would set, but the cracks were visible, and they would widen. Meanwhile, the North held Middle Tennessee. The Union now had a foothold and a launching point to strike deeper into Confederate heartland. The Confederate retreat from Stone's River did not mark the end of a campaign, but the beginning of a slow, relentless unraveling. The Western theater, once filled with grand ambitions and sweeping offensives, had turned into a theater of frustration, bickering, and squandered opportunities. General Braxton Bragg, despite holding command over the newly renamed Army of Tennessee, found himself increasingly isolated. His subordinates, men like Hardee, Breckinridge, and Polk, held him in open contempt. The bitterness within the officer corps festered like an untreated wound, and every decision Bragg made seemed to further erode morale. He issued contradictory orders, failed to consult his senior commanders, and blamed others when things went wrong. In Washington, Lincoln remained deeply focused on the West. The Mississippi River, the spine of the continent, was still divided. Vicksburg stood defiant, controlling the river like a cork in a bottle. Lincoln famously declared, "The war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket." But to take Vicksburg, the Union would have to launch a new offensive through the shattered Southern lines, over vast swaths of rugged terrain, against armies still capable of fierce resistance. The man who would lead that campaign, the Vicksburg campaign, was none other than Ulysses S. Grant. But as 1863 began, Grant was not yet a national hero. He was still rebuilding trust after the horrors of Shiloh, still under quiet scrutiny from political generals and newspaper editors who distrusted his methods and questioned his past. Yet Grant had learned something crucial at Shiloh, not just about war, but about people. He had seen what chaos looked like, and he understood now that victory required more than numbers, it required clarity. The battles of 1862 Shiloh, Corinth, Perryville, Stones River had all taught the same brutal lesson. This war would not be won by maneuver alone. It would not be decided by one sweeping campaign or the seizing of a single city. It would be won or lost through endurance. In the months following Stones River, both sides prepared for the next phase of war. The Confederacy, low on supplies, manpower, and unity, relied increasingly on cavalry raids, homegrown industry, and the illusion of invincibility. Nathan Bedford Forrest, John Hunt Morgan, and Earl Van Dorn carved their names into legend with daring strikes behind Union lines, burning bridges, derailing trains, and severing telegraph wires. But for every raid, the Union struck deeper. The machine of war, fueled by northern industry and protected by river ironclads, could afford to absorb losses and return stronger. It was a game of arithmetic, and the Union had the larger ledger. In Corinth, Mississippi, the memory of Beauregard's deception lingered. The town never recovered from the siege, its wells still poisoned, its streets silent. Grant had wanted to move on Vicksburg immediately, but conditions made that impossible. Disease, broken rail lines, and drought left Union forces temporarily stranded. Halleck, ever cautious, refused to risk another disaster. He ordered the army dispersed to secure occupied territory, but Grant waited, watched, and plotted. Meanwhile, in Chattanooga, the gateway to Georgia, Bragg entrenched his men and brooded. His failures haunted him. The Kentucky invasion had cost lives and prestige. The bickering among his generals reached new heights. A court of inquiry was suggested. Letters flew between field and capital. Davis refused to intervene, fearing internal collapse if he removed another commander. Thus, dysfunction festered. The Army of Tennessee, once brimming with zeal, now marched under clouded command and clenched teeth. Every officer knew the truth, but dared not say it aloud. The war was no longer going in their favor. By the spring of 1863, a pattern had emerged. Confederate offensives in the West were over. The Union, battered and bloodied, had nonetheless achieved strategic superiority across much of Tennessee and northern Mississippi. Grant's star was rising. Rosecrans held Middle Tennessee. Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation, turning the war into something more than preservation. It was now a fight for transformation. But the cost had been immense. In less than 12 months, the battles of Shiloh, Corinth, Perryville, and Stones River had collectively killed or wounded more than 60,000 men. Some historians call it the Year of Blood. Others call it the crucible of modern American warfare. And yet nothing had truly been decided. The Confederacy still stood. Vicksburg still defied Union warships. The Tennessee River still marked a line of fire. And in the hearts of many Americans, both Northern and Southern, the question lingered: what was this war really about? Territory, Union, slavery, honor. At Shiloh, it began as a gamble. At Stones River, it felt like a reckoning. But the war, the true war, was just beginning. The battles had shown the scale of violence to come. The leaders had learned how far they would have to go. And the people, once naive, now understood the price of ideology turned to action. In the forests of Tennessee, beneath crumbled stone churches and sunken wagon roads, that price had already been paid in full. Yet it was not enough. Not yet. It's often said that the American Civil War was a conflict between two civilizations, one industrial, one agrarian, one committed to preserving a republic, the other to defending a way of life rooted in slavery. But before any of that could be tested in blood, something else had to die. At Shiloh. It was the illusion. In the opening months of 1861 and 1862, volunteers marched to fife and drum, dreaming of glory. Young men in gray and blue alike believed the war would be short and the victories easy, and the homecoming swift. They packed letters and Bibles, posed for photographs, and sang ballads of honor and destiny. But when the smoke cleared at Pittsburgh Landing, those illusions lay shattered beside the bodies of 23 000 men, torn uniforms, open mouths, eyes that still stared at nothing. One Confederate lieutenant, wandering the field after the battle, wrote, "We thought this was a game, but war is not a game. It is a devouring thing, and it does not care who it devours." Union soldiers, digging graves through rain-soaked soil, muttered the same questions. Why here? Why now? How many more? From the hornet's nest to the slaughter pen to hell's half-acre. These places became etched into national memory, but not as triumphs. As tombs. Shiloh did not decide the war, but it changed it. It proved that this conflict would not be decided by parades or proclamations, that flags and music could not stop canister shot. That courage, however abundant, could not undo poor planning. It exposed the weaknesses of generals, the arrogance of strategists, and the fragility of institutions. And for the first time, America glimpsed the scale of what it had unleashed. If Shiloh was the awakening, Stone's River was the confirmation. The Union victory there was not clean. It was not decisive, but it was desperately needed. For Lincoln, it was political oxygen after the choking smoke of Fredericksburg. For the Union Army, it was a foothold in the hostile terrain of the South. And for African Americans in Tennessee, it was a flicker of something dangerously close to hope. Yet the battle's legacy lies not just in what was gained, but in what endured. Stone's River was the only major battle where both armies planned to attack on the same day, and still, neither truly knew the other was coming. It was a symphony of coincidence, a collision born of mutual blindness. And it was that randomness, that indifference of war to human intention, that made it so terrifying. Soldiers on both sides remembered the sound most of all, the music the night before, bands from Union and Confederate camps playing over the river, competing songs, jeers at first, then mirroring, then one song, Home Sweet Home, rising from both shores. That moment, more than the bloodshed that followed, haunted the survivors. For a brief instant, two warring armies remembered what they had once shared. And then they forgot. They rose in the dawn and killed each other. What kind of war is that? One where you sing with your enemy before trying to end him? Perhaps it's a civil war. Perhaps it's something darker. Today, visitors to Shiloh and Stone's River walk through carefully maintained parks. They read markers. They follow trails. They try to imagine what it must have been like. But imagination can only take you so far. They cannot hear the sound of bones striking a wagon wheel at full gallop. They cannot smell the powder or feel the grip of mud that swallows boots and cannon wheels alike. They cannot know what it means to watch a friend, a brother, a commander vanish into smoke and return in pieces. They cannot hear Albert Sidney Johnston whispering his last command before falling silent in the Tennessee woods. They cannot stand in the round forest and feel the weight of bodies piled 3 deep where men refuse to yield even as their blood turned the soil black. What they can do, however, is remember, because remembering matters. These battles, these moments, they are not just stories. They are mirrors. They show us what happens when a nation divides, when politics become poison, and when humanity is buried beneath loyalty. They remind us that victory and virtue are not always the same, that glory often rides beside horror, that unity must be forged, not simply declared. Shiloh, Corinth, Perryville, Stones River. These were not just battles, they were warnings, and we are still listening,